Good afternoon. I am Susan Eckert, a member of the Library Committee, to welcome you to the Plymouth Harbor Book Review. We've shown one on Channel 195. This one will be on the in-house TV, and we're hoping that the next one will also be there. This is a whole new ball game for us to do it this way. Our next review will be of Speak Memory by Vladimir Nabokov, and it will be presented by Cynthia Lichtenstein. The other book review that I look forward to, many of them, but that through the Sarasota Library group, the One Community, One Read. And if you go on the Sarasota County Library website right now, you will see a list of 10 books that they are choosing from. They'll choose one, and it's to celebrate Sarasota's 100th birthday. So you might want to check that out, and we'll have the name of that shortly when the decision is made. Our presentation today of The Night Watchman will be by Catha Abrahams. And Catha's background is as an educator, a teacher, a executive director of a rape crisis center and counseling center, and being very involved in nonprofit groups and being on the boards of those. She's always been a wonderful reader, and for many years ran the book club at her condo on Longboat Key. So it's very interesting to talk to Catha about books because she is very active as a reader. We look forward to her presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. The book we're going to discuss today is The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. And although I've done lots of book clubs, haven't done a whole huge number of PowerPoint presentations. This is my second one in the world. This is a picture of Louise Erdrich. Louise Erdrich was born in 1954, and the significant event in the book, The Night Watchman, takes place in 1954. So she was born the year of this event. She was born in Minnesota. Her mother was half Ojibwa and half French, and her father was a German American. Her parents taught at a boarding school in Waukegan, North Dakota. It was a boarding school set up by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Louise Erdrich was raised as a Catholic, and she did not live on the tribal reservation, but she had a lot of relatives there and visited often. And one of the relatives who did live on the reservation was her grandfather, whose name was Patrick Gourneau. He was tribal chief of the tribe on the reservation. And that reservation was called the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. Louise Erdrich got a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, and she was in the first class that was open to women at Dartmouth College. While she was there, she met a man named Michael Doris. He was the chairman of the Native American Studies program at Dartmouth. And although she knew him, they did not at that time have a romance. She graduated from Dartmouth, and she went on in 1978 to enroll in a Master of Arts program at Johns Hopkins University. And she earned a master's degree from there and continued to write. She later returned to Dartmouth as writer-in-residence, fell in love, and decided to marry. They married in 1981, and they had 6 kids together. They had 3 children he had adopted as a single parent, 3 Native American children. one of whom had fetal alcohol syndrome, and Michael Doris wrote a book about that son called The Broken Cord. That son died in his early 20s, obviously suffering from a lot of the results of fetal alcohol syndrome. He died in an automobile accident. Louise and Michael Doris had 3 natural children, but they separated in 1995. And after the separation, possibly the separation was due to this, one of the other sons accused Michael Doris of sexual abuse, and his claims were confirmed by one of their daughters. So 2 years after their separation, Michael Doris committed suicide. Louise Erdrich later on had a 7th child, and that child was conceived when she was in her 40s. The father is a Native American, but she never revealed who the father was. When Erdrich was a child, her father, who was, you recall, German American, paid her a nickel for every story she wrote. Her sister Heidi became a poet who publishes under the name Heidi Erdrich, and another sister has written children's books. Louise Erdrich today lives in Minnesota and owns and operates a bookstore called Birch Bark Books, where they not only sell books, but it functions as a kind of center for the Native American community in the Twin Cities. These are 8. These are 8 of the books that Louise Erdrich wrote. She actually has written, I think, 17. And she's won prizes for many of them. She won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Love Medicine. She won the Sue Kaufman Prize for Best First Novel for Love Medicine. She won the O. Henry Award for a short story. She won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Native Writers Circle of America. She's been the Associate Poet Laureate of North Dakota. She also writes, besides fiction, she also writes poetry. She was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of North Dakota, but she refused to accept it because the University of North Dakota had a mascot, and it was a Native American, and many Native Americans are really opposed to the use of Native American imagery as mascots for football teams and whatever. She won an honorary doctorate of letters from Dartmouth College. She won a Kenyon Review Award for literary achievement. She won the National Book Award for Fiction for the Roundhouse, which is pictured there. She won a Penn Saul Bellow Award. She won a Library of Congress Prize and a National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction. So she is extremely well respected. I personally like her books, and I belong to a small book club, and at least one person said to me, "Oh, I'm not going to read that book because I don't like the way she writes." And another good friend of mine, who I think is a really good reader, also said, "Ugh, Louise Erdrich, I don't like the way she writes." However, I'd like to read to you what some critics have said about the way Louise Erdrich writes. Erdrich's novels are noted for their depth of characterization. They're peopled by a variety of characters, some of whom appear in multiple stories. That is, if you started to read the first book she wrote and you read through, a lot of the same characters reappear with the same names. For many of the Native Americans about whom she wrote, contact with white culture brings such elements as alcoholism, Roman Catholicism, and government policies to tear down the Indian community, though tradition and loyalty to family and heritage work to counteract these forces. She was influenced by both of her parents. Her mother, if you remember my telling you, was half Ojibwe, and her father was German American. So most of her books deal with the Native American side of her heritage, but in the Master Butcher Singing Club, there's a little pointer on here, I can get that, the Master Butcher Singing Club. That one really was she drew upon her father's German American experience. Her novels have drawn comparisons with William Faulkner's novels. Like Faulkner's, Erdrich's successive novels created multiple narratives in the same fictional area and combined the tapestry of local history with current themes and modern consciousness. And I think that last phrase really describes The Night Watchman. The Night Watchman is a story that takes place on the reservation. And the reservation is, we'll skip over that. This you may not be able to read this at home, so I will read it to you. It says, Ojibwa, also spelt Ojibwe or Ojibwe, also called Chippewa. You can kind of hear how somebody once said he was Ojibwe, and it was translated into English as Chippewa, or something like that. Is an Algonquin-speaking North American Indian tribe who live in what are now Ontario and Manitoba, Canada, and Minnesota and North Dakota, from Lake Huron westward onto the plains. And this here is where her band, her ancestral band, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, lived. I don't know if the map is going to let you see it, but this is North Dakota right here, and here's Minnesota next to it. And up in this northwest corner of North Dakota is the area where this book takes place and where her family comes from. And you'll notice that just above it is Winnipeg, and in the book that's referred to quite often. This is a larger, I don't know what the word is, but I think this map might be easier for you to see. And these are some of the places mentioned in the book: Fargo and Minot, and the twin cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Winnipeg up in the north, which is in Manitoba. The history of this tribe is that there are nearly 150 different bands of Chippewa living in the northern part of the United States and southern Canada. And their first exposure to Westerners was in the early 1600s, and that was to the French. And in fact, Louise Erdrich's mother is half French and half Ojibwe. During the French and Indian War, they fought the English, so they were on the side of the French. And then they fought the English colonists, but of course lost. And their land began being eroded away from them in around 1815. In 1860, the United States government moved the tribe to a territory in Oklahoma. And you need to bear in mind, they didn't come from Oklahoma. They were much more northern. But they were moved to an Indian territory in Oklahoma. And that continued until the early 1900s. And they were gradually merged with Cree. So today, a lot of the Chippewa are of mixed blood, mostly French and English. Many live on reservations in Canada and in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, and North Dakota. So in 1954, they were living in a reservation. Let's just go on there. They were living in a reservation roughly in this area. And they had a lot of land. It's a small band, actually, and their reservation was a small reservation, but they had a lot of forest. And if you think about 1954, Eisenhower was the president. It was post-war era, and there was a huge demand for new housing. And so the industries that contribute to building new houses, notably the timber industry, were very interested in the forests that were on reservation land, not just Turtle Mountain, but several other reservations as well. And so in 1954, somebody named Arthur B. Watkins, who was a representative from the area of North Dakota, primarily Arthur B. Watkins, whose picture I have here. We'll go back to those. That's Arthur B. Watkins. He was a Mormon. He was extremely prejudiced, as we would see him today. And he initiated a resolution in the House of Representatives that would terminate the rights of Indians in several tribes on several reservations. The goal being that if the rights of these Indians were terminated, and those rights had been agreed to over history by other presidents, prior presidents of the United States, then the land would become available for private exploration. And then they could get to the forests and they could get the lumber. So the story builds around that. The central characters in this story are Thomas Wajashk, who's modeled after Louise Erdrich's grandfather. And he is a night watchman on the reservation at a factory. The factory is a jewel-bearing plant. That is a plant that makes bearings for watches and so forth out of jewels. That was very unusual. There were very few reservations that had factories on them, and this particular factory work, the type of work, was very fine, and the owners of the factory had discovered that the Native American women were very good at it. So all of the factory workers were women, and it's possible they were very good at it because they were used to doing beading. Because if I go back to some of the prior slides. Am I going back? Yes. No, I'm going forward. Sorry to wave through this way. There, if you can see these pictures, the Native American costumes of the Ojibwe or the Chippewa included a lot of very fine beadwork. So a lot of the women on the reservation were very good at that. And one of the few men employed at the factory was Thomas Wajashk, well, actually her grandfather, who was the night watchman. So the central characters in the book are Thomas Wajashk, who is the night watchman, his granddaughter Patrice, who was known as Pixie because she had slanty almond-shaped eyes, Janat, who is Pixie's mother, who's an old-fashioned Indian, a character named Mr. Barnes, who is the math teacher at the school on the reservation, and a young man named Wood Mountain, who's the love interest in the story. Two concurrent events shape the story. The first is the termination bill. And the termination bill was when they said they wanted to terminate the rights of the Indians. What that meant was the Indians would no longer be protected in any way. They would just be ordinary citizens, and all the agreements that had historically been made with the tribes would be null. And therefore, the Indians on the reservation would be treated the same as any other American. And Arthur B. Watkins, his viewpoint about that was that they didn't need any extra help. All the prior agreements supported the Indians in a lot of ways. He thought, well, they don't need the help anymore because they've got the jewel-bearing plant, so they're independent. But the women at the jewel-bearing plant made very little money, and everybody else on the reservation was really, really poor. So when they talked about terminating the rights, the tribal status, in the eyes of the Indians and in the eyes of Thomas Wajuk, who was not just the night watchman, but was also the tribal chief, to him, terminate really meant exterminate. It meant that all of the Indians would lose all these extra supports, like medical care and education. They would be on their own, just as if they were any other citizen in the United States. And because they were going to be on their own, they would have, for example, to pay taxes on their land, as most of the rest of us have all of our lives. And if they had to pay the taxes on their land, they would be unable to do so because they had no way to earn a living on the reservation. They would then be forced to sell their land to whites, and they would be forced to move into the cities. And in fact, the bill itself reads, to provide for the termination of federal supervision over the trust and restricted property of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, and the individual members thereof, for intensification in the orderly relocation of such Indians in areas of greater economic opportunity and for other purposes. So the goal was to move the Indians off the reservation land and move them into the cities, where, if we look at history, nothing good did happen or could happen. So that's one. The novel deals first with that, and the fact that this is an actual event, but in the novel's concerned with the quest Thomas Wajuk has for finding support among the other Indians to fight this House resolution and to raise the money. And actually, according to Louise Erdrich, the method in the book is the method that was actually used, which is that they had a boxing tournament, a boxing match, and Wood Mountain, who, as I said, is the love interest in the book, was one of the boxers. And everybody, although everyone was very poor, everyone could kind of ante up a small amount of money for the tickets, and then they used the tickets for a group of men to go to Washington, D.C. and attempt to stop the termination bill. The second situation in the book is, and it's also a quest, is the mysterious disappearance of Pixie's older sister. Pixie had an older sister named Vera, who left the reservation with her husband, who was a new husband, and went down to the Twin Cities and has not been heard from in more than a year. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which at that time, by the way, was run by the same man who put all the Japanese Americans into concentration camps. His name was Meyer. The Bureau of Indian Affairs provided money to Native Americans who were on the reservation who wanted to leave and go to the cities. And so Vera accepted that money and went to the city, but disappeared. So relatives of Pixies, through Native American dreaming or other ways, came to the conclusion that Vera was in terrible trouble and that she had had a baby. And so Pixie took her savings from working at the jewel-bearing plant and went down to the Twin Cities, where she had never been. She'd never been in a city in her life. And she, in the book, goes down to the Twin Cities to attempt to find her sister. And Wood Mountain goes with her. So that is the second, the two sort of side-by-side stories in the book, which are two different quests. Surrounding the two storylines are Pixie's attempt to find her own voice to experience love, to have a sexual relationship, and to negotiate between the two worlds, the world that she knows on the reservation and the world, the American, if you will, the modern United States 20th century world. In the course of the story, through painful memories that Thomas has, we learn about things like the boarding schools to which Native American children were abducted. And I had a picture that I wanted you to see. This is a picture of 4 little girls who were in boarding school. Actually, it's quite shocking, but there were 357 of these boarding schools. And in 1925, 60,000 or more Native American children were in boarding school. By 1926, 83% of Indian school-age children were attending them. And lots of them, but not all of them, were run by the church. And that schooling didn't really end until the 1960s. And you can, in the novel, you get a real sense of how painful that experience was. I don't want you to see that yet. How painful that experience was for many Native American children. For example, one of the things that these schools did immediately was cut the children's hair. And in the Ojibwe culture, cutting hair means it's something you do if you've been bereaved. If someone in your family has died, you cut your hair. Otherwise, you never cut it. So for a child to be taken from its parent and put into a totally foreign environment and then have his hair cut was really traumatic. And a lot of the children had very traumatic experiences in those schools. Some of that is referred to and described in the book. Another thing that's mentioned in the book in the course of Pixie's quest to find Vera in the cities is the whole issue, which is prevalent today, which is the issue of how many Native American girls disappear in our world, even today. And the description of what happens to Vera in the book is really a little bit disturbing. The book is really a nice book to read. It's a little bit of history, and it's a little bit of Native American religion, and it's a love story, and Pixie is a charming young woman. There's lots and lots of enjoyable things about this book, but the one thing that is not enjoyable is to read about Vera's situation. And that is, in 2018, the Seattle-based Urban Indian Health Institute completed a survey, and they reported 5,712 missing Alaskan, Native, and American Indian women, and only 16 of those were registered in the Department of Justice database. So all of these women, 5,700 of them, were girls who had disappeared, and the tribal peoples had a great deal of difficulty getting anybody to pay attention to that. And to some extent, that is part of the subject of The Roundhouse, which was the book that Louise Erdrich published a few years ago, which won a lot of awards. But that is still going on, and it's highlighted in the book, which is why I really feel that the comparison of the remark that I read to you about Louise Erdrich combining local history with current themes and modern consciousness is so that you get Native American religion in this book and you get contemporary problems. So that's the story. That's what the story is about. And I would just like to finish by reading a couple of excerpts so you get a flavor of what the style is that she writes. This is her description of Thomas Wajuk, the night watchman. She says, Thomas was of the after the buffalo, who are we now generation. He was born on the reservation, grew up on the reservation, assumed he would die there also. Thomas owned a watch. He had no memory of time according only to the sun and moon. He spoke the old language first, and also spoke English with a soft grain and almost imperceptible accent. This accent would only belong to those of his generation. This indefinably soft but firm way of speaking would be lost. His generation would have to define themselves. Who is an Indian? What? Who? So that is Thomas. And this is a description of Janat, who's Pixie's mother, and comes back down to Pixie. Pixie, by the way, is a young woman. She's 19 or so when the story opens. Everyone calls her Pixie because her eyes are almond-shaped, but she wishes to be known as Patrice. And so that's a kind of running theme in the book, is the people who are willing to see her as Patrice. But it's important to remember she sees herself not as Pixie. Pixie was cute. Janat was capable and shrewd. She was a woman of presence, strong and square, jutting features. She was traditional, an old-time Indian, raised by her grandparents only speaking Chippewa, schooled from childhood in ceremonies and the teaching stories. Janat's knowledge was considered so important that she had been fiercely hidden away, guarded from going to boarding school. She had barely learned to read and write on the intermittent days she had attended reservation day school. She made baskets and beadwork to sell, but Janet's real job was passing on what she knew. People came from distances, often camped around their house in order to learn. Once, that deep knowledge had been part of a web of strategies that included plenty of animals to hunt, wild food to gather, gardens of beans and squash, and land, lots of land to roam. Now the family had only Patrice, who had been raised speaking Chippewa but had no trouble learning English, who had followed most of her mother's teachings but also became a Catholic. Patrice knew her mother's songs, but she had also been class valedictorian, and the English teacher had given her a book of poems by Emily Dickinson. There was one about success from failure's point of view. She had seen how quickly girls who got married and had children were worn down before the age of 20. Nothing happened to them but toil. Great things happened to other people. The married girls were lost. That wasn't going to be her life. So the book, The Night Watchman, is really about the negotiating the pathway between still being an Indian and also being a contemporary American. And I hope if you haven't read it, you enjoy it.